A few names disappear from history since they were never composed down, and a few names are eradicated on reason by hands that wish the past to stay buried in shadows. And in the spring of 1865, when the war between brothers had fair finished, and the arrive was still trembling from the strides of officers returning domestic, the town of Elmbrook in the calm slopes of Pennsylvania made an implicit settlement to disregard one title, totally to seal it absent from records and supplications. And indeed, from the lips of children, that title was Ruth Carver, a lady whose story, or maybe the conviction of her story, was so unsettling that the individuals who once gestured to her in the road and shared bread at the advertised started to turn their faces as she passed until she got to be something more than an individual and less than a ghost. She had been espoused to Thomas Carver, a man whose uniform was still wrinkled from the tailor when he kissed her farewell and strolled toward a prepare bound for the war zones, and the story that spread in whispers was that Thomas never made it domestic lively. However, the truth of how or why remained covered up in the folds of rumor and doubt. A few said he passed on a fever, a few said of lead and powder, but others with colder voices demanded he had been touched by harm. Sometime recently he ever cleared out the warm security of Elmbrook, and they claimed to have seen Ruth and her little plant on the night sometime recently. His takeoff bowing over the soil beneath the light of a single light, her hands moving in a rushed, interesting way, as in spite of the fact that burying not seeds but secrets after the war the town had anticipated Ruth to wear dark for her spouse, and bow her head in church and grieve in the way they thought appropriate. However, she wore her pain like a coat with the buttons fixed. Appearing not one or the other tears nor collapse, she proceeded tending her domestic and tending to herself, as in spite of the fact that the misfortune was a private matter that no one else was owed, and this refusal to perform distress got to be another stone in the divider the town was building against her. The divider developed higher when Samuel Reed, a youthful man who had returned from the war with a limp and a grin, was final seen heading up the path to Ruth Carver's entryway. He carried a bundle beneath his arm, maybe a blessing or a favor owed to her, but when inquired afterward, Ruth said he had never arrived, and however a child who had been gathering igniting in the woodlot swore that Samuel had stood upon her patio, and that the entryway had opened to let him in. Samuel never came out once more at slightest not that anybody saw soon. The Reverend Pike paid Ruth a visit beneath the pretense of advertising supplication and consolation. He talked of misfortune and the ruler, but his eyes were drawn to an upstairs room whose entryway had been nailed closed. Ruth told him it was capacity for things she no longer utilized, but Pike said afterward that as he presented sacred text, he listened to blackout sporadic sound from behind that entryway, like a voice not calling for offer assistance, but talking in a moderate mumbled cadence as if telling a story to itself. By the time harvest time extended into ice, the individuals of Elmbrook had chosen something must be done, and one moonless night a bunch of men strolled the way to Ruth's domestic, carrying lights, their light influencing in the dull like little captured suns. But when Ruth replied their thump, she grinned with a calmness that unsettled them. She told them you ought to not be here, and in spite of the fact that none of them may review precisely what was said or done in the minutes that taken after each of them cleared out with his confront depleted of color, and not one would talk of it again in December, as snow powdered the rooftops and the quarry lay solidified beneath a pale sky. Agriculturist riding to showcase saw Ruth strolling toward that quarry at first light. She was carrying an expansive wooden trunk, and in spite of the fact that he advertised to offer assistance, she denied, saying, as it were, "It is lighter than it looks." He proceeded down the street, but when he looked back at the twist, she was gone, and the white way behind her was unmarked by any path of feet. The trunk was never seen once more, nor was Ruth. The town responded not with look parties or grieving, but with quiet, They'd boarded her house, they struck her title from the church rolls, they told their children to talk of other things, and in that winter, Elmbrook made itself disregard her years past until one night the house stood ablaze. No one claimed to know how the fire started, but those who assembled to observe swore. They saw shapes moving in the upstairs rooms indeed as the roof collapsed, and one outline was said to coordinate Ruth's slight outline holding something in her arms. Travelers and afterward decades some of the time talked of assembly, a pale lady in obsolete dress strolling close, the quarry with a light in one hand and the recommendation of an overwhelming burden in the other. A man claimed she inquired him if the town still recalled her. Another said she, as it were, looked at him with eyes that appeared to know his name long after the living ceased caring the arrive itself appeared to hold her memory, in the crunch of ice on the quarry's edge, in the resound of boots where no one strolled, and in the feeling that now and then there was another pulse in the stillness, and in spite of the fact that history books of Elmbrook never specify her, and no stone bears her title, Ruth Carver waits not in words but in that bizarre domain between the recalled and the deleted. And if you ever discover yourself close the quarry on a calm winter night and you see a light swinging gradually in the dull, you may listen her voice inquiring if you will keep in mind her indeed when all others have chosen to disregard. Elmbrook was a little disconnected town built on timber and coal, the kind of put where the same families had lived for eras and where the slopes and hollows appeared to overlay in on themselves, catching each resound and shadow in the same. Discussed year after year in 80 and 65, the gracious war had fair finished clearing out behind injured veterans and lamenting families, and for most the war's conclusion was the alleviation, a delicate murmur of survival after a long time of instability. But for Ruth Carver, it checked the starting of her inconveniences. Ruth had been a youthful bride when the war started, and inside a year she was a dowager. Her spouse, Elias, never returned from the battling, and his body was never recouped. She had held up for letters that never came, standing on her patio at sunset, observing for the figure that would never show up. When the news at last come to her, it came not with an official wire, but with the calm words of a officer who had battled nearby Elias, telling her that he had fallen in a field distant from domestic, and that there had been no time to bury him appropriate. Ruth wore dark for a year, and at that point another and another, as if the color had gotten to be portion of her skin, and the townsfolk started to see her not as Ruth, but as the Dowager Carver. Life after Elias was a moderate unraveling. Ruth attempted to keep the house the way it had been, with the wood stove burning and the plant worked each spring, but work was rare for a lady alone, and whispers started to take after her in the limit paths of Elmbrook. At to begin with, they were almost feel sorry for destitute Ruth all alone, such a disgrace, and at that point gradually they turned into something more honed and less pardoning. Individuals talked of interesting lights in her windows late at night, of her strolling into the woods without a light and returning with her skirts soggy and her hands purged. Children challenged each other to run up to her yard and thump fair to see if she would reply, and when she did they swore her eyes looked as well, shining in the candlelight. The conclusion of the war brought troopers domestic, a few entire and a few broken, and among them were men who had known Elias or claimed to Ruth, listened their stories and said thanks to them, but a few of their stories were diverse from the one she had been told. A few said Elias had been injured but was taken absent by obscure hands. Some time recently he seemed made a difference. Others whispered that he had left and fled west. The inconsistencies started to bite at her. Ruth began inquiring questions. Approximately where Elias had been final seen, and approximately a little farmhouse closed the front where somebody said he had been shielded, and in inquiring she blended something in the town that numerous wished would stay undisturbed by. Late summer of 1865, Ruth had gotten to be a figure. The individuals of Elmbrook dodged her title, talked as it were in kitchens and behind closed entryways. It was said she kept a box beneath her bed with letters composed in a dialect. No one may perused. It was said she lit a single candle in the upstairs window each night and talked out loud to the obscurity. A few claimed they listened a man's voice replying her. When she strolled into the common store, the discussion would drop quiet and the business person would serve her rapidly without assembling her gaze. Autumn came and the takes-off fell in moderate spirals onto the sloppy lanes, and still Ruth was seen meandering the edge of the woods that bordered the ancient quarry, where the ground was delicate and misleading. One night a gather of boys taken after her at a separate and swore she strolled straight into the trees, and did not come out once more in spite of the fact that they held up until first light. The following morning she was seen on her patio, clearing as if nothing had happened. Ministers started to talk from the lectern around allurement and inconspicuous disasters. His words were sharp, but he never named her straightforwardly. Still, everybody knew who he implied. Ruth started to go to church less and less, and by winter, she halted going totally. The snow that year was overwhelming, and the coal trains ran moderate, clearing out the town colder and calmer than normal amid those long evenings. The stories approximately. Ruth developed more. Expand. A few said she had called her spouse back from the grave. Others said she had taken up with a trooper who never existed in the tissue at Elin. February 1866. Something happened that made the whispers turn into something harder and more perilous. A seeker was found dead in the woods close the quarry, his rifle still stacked, and no marks on his body, but for the wide gazing eyes of a man who had seen something. He ought to not have the final individual to have talked to him was Ruth. She had been seen giving him a bundle wrapped in cloth. Closed the post street. When inquired around it, she said it was bread for his travel. The coroner might not decide a cause of passing, and the seeker was buried rapidly without much ceremony. From that day on, the town appeared to move as one intellect against her. No one sold her merchandise but at twice the cost. No one came to her entryway to exchange. No one advertised her offer assistance. In the profound solidify of late winter, her heap of wood was strangely scattered in the night, and she had to assemble the pieces herself from the snow when spring defrosted the ice in the rivulet. She was seldom seen at all, and the grass in her yard developed tall and uncut by the summer of 1866. Ruth Carver was gone. Her house stood purged, with the window ornaments drawn and the front entryway locked from the interior. When the sheriff at last constrained it open, the rooms were uncovered but for a single chair in the kitchen, and the dark dress she had continuously worn collapsed perfectly on the table. There was no sign of her anyplace. A few said she had gone west. Others said she had strolled into the woods one final time and never returned. There were indeed those who claimed to have seen her strolling on the street to the quarry at sundown, carrying a light, in spite of the fact that when they taken after the light, they found nothing but fog rising from the stone pits in the long time that taken after Elmbrook developed littler as the mines closed and families moved absent. The Carver house decayed and fell, and the ground where it had stood got to be congested with briars. However, indeed, decades afterward, a few townsfolk claimed to see a lady in dark on the edge of the woods her confront. Pale and constant her eyes, catching what small light there was and holding it as well. Long by the time the 20th century started, Ruth Carver's title was no longer talked straightforwardly. Her story got to be one of those things children whispered to panic each other at night, and more seasoned people denied knowing anything almost. But in the dim corners of Elmbrook, there were still those who swore she had been wronged, that she had been eradicated on reason, not for what she had done, but for what she had found out. And they said that someplace in the profound folds of the slopes, she was still strolling, still looking for the truth around her spouse, and the night he vanished from the war until the end of time. Ruth was a dowager. Her spouse, Thomas Carver, had gone to the war and never returned. The paper from the armed force said he had passed on, but the words on that paper were bizarre, and lean they said, small they gave no clear account, as it were, that his benefit was over and that his title was entered among the fallen the town of Fiery, Debris Empty knew how to handle most dowagers. They brought bread and stew, they talked delicately, and came to offer assistance with clothing. They sat together in church and whispered supplications for the souls of the misplaced men. But with Ruth it was not the same from the day. The wire arrived. She carried herself in a way the town found unordinary. A few said she did not tremble when she opened the collapsed message. A few said her eyes filtered it once, and at that point she collapsed it once more and set it aside as if it were nothing more than a letter around the climate. There were those who'd taken note that she did not howl, she did not sob sometime recently. Others, she did not wear the long, overwhelming, dark, grieving dresses for the full year as the other ladies. Did she put absent the cloak sooner than anticipated? She ventured into the road without the crepe trim on her sleeves. Inside weeks, and this was sufficient for conversation to grow in cinder empty conversation, was a trim that developed in each season a thing that did not require water, as it were the littlest seed of strangeness may take root and spread, and with Ruth there was soil sufficient for numerous seeds. She lived at the distant edge of town in a little cabin she and Thomas had built. When they hitched in '62, it sat close the cottonwoods with the waterway not distant off. She worked her cultivate, tended her dairy animals, and patched dress for the common store. She was calm but not unpleasant still. There was a divider approximately her no one seemed say they knew her well for. Thomas cleared out for war. He had been a carpenter his hands. Solid his way indeed. He was not the sort of man to rush his words or raise his voice. He and Ruth kept to themselves and in a put like Fiery. Debris empty that made individuals figure at what was covered up behind their closed entryway. When he enrolled the town, endorsed for a man to serve the Union was an honor, and the ladies of the town said to Ruth, "You will be pleased." She gestured but said little. War a long time past, and letters from Thomas were few. A few pondered if he might compose at all, or if maybe the letters were misplaced in the chaos of the battling. When news came in '65 that the war was over, numerous men returned domestic entirety in body, or else limping or with an purge sleeve, but Thomas was not among them. The message that came to Ruth gave no clear reply. A few accepted. He had been murdered in the fight of Franklin. Others whispered he had forsaken in the perplexity and gone into hiding. Ruth did not affirm or deny any of it, and that was the starting of the genuine doubt. The ladies of the town who had misplaced spouses wore their pain like an identification. They let their tears drop in church. They inclined on the arms of neighbors. They let individuals see the weight of misfortune on them. Ruth instep was still. She moved through her days as sometime recently, her back straight, her confront garbled. This calm got to be the conversation of each back room and patio. A few started to say that she had known he would not return. Long sometime recently the message came, and maybe had indeed wished it, that wavy summer the stories developed more honed. Somebody claimed she had been seen talking with a stranger in the night, close her fence. Another swore that a man had been interior her cabin with the light blown out and as it were a single candle burning by the window. They said he was tall and strolled with a limp, and in spite of the fact that no one talked the title, everybody thought the same thing: Thomasine eminent. Ruth ceased going to church. Through and through that same month, the word witch showed up carved profound into her fence post. The letters, rough but plain, she did not sand them absent. She cleared out them to climate and obscure in the rain and sun. The carving got to be a stamp to a few that the prattle was right, that she was not a legitimate dowager, that she kept privileged insights as well, huge for the great of the town. And the third day of October, at the edge of first light, a neighbor saw Ruth strolling toward the waterway. She carried a bundle wrapped in an ancient knit. It hung overwhelming in her arms, and the way she held it made it seem more like a weight than a blessing. A few said it seemed have been a child. Others said something wrapped for burial. She was seen venturing into the haze that rolled off the water, and at that point she was seen no more. Her cabin stood purge The entryway unlatched for days. Sometime recently, anybody went interior. When they did, they found it slick and uncovered as if she had taken nothing, and however cleared out nothing behind by winter, the sheets were pried absent for stumble. The stones of the chimney scattered in the parcel, the arrived never sold, and no modern house was built upon. It be the following year, her title was gone from the church record, and her property stamped surrendered letters sent to her family in Missouri went unanswered. It was as if the Carver title had been rubbed out from the book of Cinder Empty itself. And in the long time that taken after less and less individuals conceded to recalling her at all. Ruth was a dowager. Her spouse, Thomas Carver, had gone to the war and never returned the paper from the armed force. Said he had passed on, but the words on that paper were bizarre and lean. They said small. They gave no clear account as it were that his benefit was over and that his title was entered among the fallen. The town of Fiery, debris empty, knew how to handle most dowagers. They brought bread and stew, they talked delicately and came to offer assistance with clothing. They sat together in church and whispered supplications for the souls of the misplaced men, but with Ruth it was not the same from the day the wire arrived. She carried herself in a way the town found unordinary. A few said she did not tremble when she opened the collapsed message. A few said her eyes filtered it once, and at that point she collapsed it once more and set it aside. As if it were nothing more than a letter around the climate. There were those who taken note that she did not howl. She did not sob some time recently. Others, she did not wear the long, overwhelming, dark grieving dresses for the full year as the other ladies. Did she put absent the cloak sooner than anticipated? She ventured into the road without the crepe trim on her sleeves inside weeks, and this was sufficient for conversation to grow in cinder empty. Conversation was a trim that developed in each season a thing that did not require water, as it were. The littlest seed of strangeness may take root and spread, and with Ruth there was soil sufficient for numerous seeds. She lived at the distant edge of town in a little cabin she and Thomas had built. When they hitched in '62, it sat close the cottonwoods with the waterway not distant off. She worked her cultivate, tended her dairy animals, and patched dress for the common store. She was calm, but not unpleasant. Still, there was a divider approximately her. No one seemed say they knew her well for. Thomas cleared out for war. He had been a carpenter, his hands solid, his way. Indeed, he was not the sort of man to rush his words or raise his voice. He and Ruth kept to themselves, and in a put like fiery debris, empty, that made individuals figure at what was covered up behind their closed entryway. When he enrolled, the town endorsed for a man to serve the Union was an honor, and the ladies of the town said to Ruth, "You will be pleased." She gestured, but said little. War a long time passed, and letters from Thomas were few. A few pondered if he might compose at all, or if maybe the letters were misplaced in the chaos of the battling. When news came in '65 that the war was over, numerous men returned, domestic entirety in body, or else limping or with impurged sleeve, but Thomas was not among them. The message that came to Ruth gave no clear reply. A few accepted he had been murdered in the fight of Franklin. Others whispered he had forsaken in the perplexity and gone into hiding. Ruth did not affirm or deny any of it, and that was the starting of the genuine doubt. The ladies of the town who had misplaced spouses wore their pain like identification. They let their tears drop in church. They inclined on the arms of neighbors. They let individuals see the weight of misfortune on them. Ruth in step was still. She moved through her days as sometime recently her back straight, her confront garbled. This calm got to be the conversation of each back room and patio. A few started to say that she had known he would not return long. Sometime recently the message came, and maybe had indeed wished it. That way be summer the stories developed. More home. Somebody claimed she had been seen talking with a stranger in the night. Close her fence. Another swore that a man had been interior her cabin with the light blown out, and as it were a single candle burning by the window. They said he was tall and strolled with a limp, and in spite of the fact that no one talked the title, everybody thought the same thing. Thomasine eminent Ruth ceased going to church through that same month the word which showed up carved profound into her fence post, the letters. Rough but plain, she did not sand them absent, she cleared out them to climate and obscure. In the rain and sun the carving got to be a stamp to a few that the prattle was right, that she was not a legitimate dowager, that she kept privileged insights as well huge for the grade of the townin. The third day of October at the edge of First, light a neighbor saw Ruth strolling toward the waterway. She carried a bundle wrapped in an ancient knit. It hung overwhelming in her arms, and the way she held it made it seem more like a weight than a blessing. A few said it seemed to have been a child. Others said something wrapped for burial. She was seen venturing into the haze that rolled off the water, and at that point she was seen no more. Her cabin stood purged, the entryway unlatched for days. Sometime recently anybody went interior. When they found it slick and uncovered, as if she had taken nothing and however cleared out nothing behind. By winter the sheets were pried absent, for stumble the stones of the chimney scattered in the parcel. The arrive never sold, and no modern house was built upon Ibby. The following year her title was gone from the church record, and her property, stamped surrendered letters sent to her family in Missouri, went unanswered. It was as if the Carver title had been rubbed out from the book of cinder empty itself, and in the long time that taken after less and less individuals conceded to recalling her at a lie at the stream, kept a kind of memory. In 1912, a rancher plowing the moo ground by the ancient crossing turned up a discolored silver memento. Interior was the photo of a Union warrior and a bolt of hair. A few said the confront was Thomas Carver. Others swore it was not at all the man they recollected in the town. The revelation mixed ancient whispers, but no confirmation came, and the memento passed into private hands sometime recently. Any record was matrimony a long time afterward. Analysts in the Kansas State Chronicles found letters composed amid the war that implied Thomas had survived harmed and needed for renunciation. One letter talked of a lady in fiery remains empty who kept him covered up until courses of action might be made for the match to vanish west together. If this was genuine at that point, Ruth's calm on the day the wire came would be no riddle. She would have known the paper was the untrue finishing to their story. Still, there were those who accepted another adaptation, that Ruth had gone to the stream with the bundle and ventured into the water, the weight pulling her down, that her body floated absent or settled in the profound channel where no one would ever discover it, and in that telling the bundle might have been the memento and a few belonging, or maybe the truth was stranger still and misplaced entirely. Whether she cleared out with Thomas or was claimed by the stream, the impact on the town was the same. Fiery remains empty deleted her in life and in memory, but presently, and at that point, somebody strolling along the riverbank on a mist overwhelming morning claims to see a figure in dark standing among the reeds. Her look settled on the water as if holding up for something or somebody to rise from it once more. To begin with, whisper that genuinely mattered in the story of Ruth Carver was not approximately how she carried herself. When the wire came, it was not around how she did not cry in the road or wear the overwhelming widow's cloak for a full year. It was not indeed around the men seen strolling to her cabin after dim. No, that to begin with, whisper was more seasoned. It come to back to the exceptionally night sometime recently Thomas Carver cleared out for the war, and it started with the words of an ancient neighbor, a lady who had lived in fiery remains empty since sometime recently. That to begin with, board of the common store was nailed into put. She had observed the Carvers from the day they arrived in town in '62. Youthful and new from Missouri, with the sea of individuals prepared to construct something of their claim. She recalled when the cabin went up, when the corn columns were planted, when the to begin with smoke rose from the chimney, and she recalled the night she saw Ruth out in the cultivate long after most lights had been put out. She said the evening was sharp and cool, and the moon was shining sufficient to paint shadows the estimate of men over the yard. She had been sitting by her possess window repairing a tear in a fleece coat when the sound came black out and unfaltering the sound of a spade gnawing into the soil when she inclined forward to see. She saw the figure of Ruth bowed moo and her cultivate her skirts brushing the ground. Her hands moving speedy and cautious, she burrowed into the soil with the speed of somebody who did not need to be caught in the act at that point. She delayed and unwrapped something little from a strip of cloth the neighbor might not make out. The shape in the moonlight, as it were, that it was not the shape of bread or meat, and it was not the shape of anything from a kitchen. Pale Ruth set it into the gap, secured it over with the new soil, and squeezed it level with the back of the spade. She looked up once toward the cabin as if making beyond any doubt no light had showed up in the window at that point. She strolled absent, carrying the strip of cloth back. Interior, her skirts brushing the soil from her hands, the entirety thing was over in minutes, but the locate of it established itself in the ancient woman's intellect, and would not come lucid following morning. The neighbor halted by beneath the pretense of bringing a jostle of molasses. She inquired after Thomas, and talked of his taking off the another day. She inquired as well almost the work in the plant, the night sometime recently, and Ruth's confront was calm as still water. She said it had been nothing more than ruined nourishment gone acrid as well, distant to nourish to the pigs, and as well foul to keep close the house. She had buried it to keep the scent from blowing in through the windows. The neighbor gestured and said no more, but in her heart she did not accept it. She had lived as well longed to think that a lady required the cover of haziness to toss absent table scraps. She knew there were less demanding ways. She knew that pigs would eat nearly anything, and that a fire may burn what was more regrettable than spoil. She knew as well that anything Ruth had put into the ground was wrapped, as in spite of the fact that it mattered still, the neighbor kept her quiet at slightest in those early days, for Thomas was set to take off for the war, and the town wished him well. On his travel, he cleared out on the morning prepare, carrying a canvas pack with his uniform and the little tin container that hung from the strap. Once sometime recently, he climbed on board, and at that point she ventured back into the shade of the station. Her hands collapsed sometime recently. She did not wave as the prepare pulled absent, in spite of the fact that others did. She, as it were, observed until the smoke trailed lean against the sky, and at that point she turned for domestic, strolling alone along the dusty street to the edge of town. It was months. Sometime recently word came from Thomas, and when it did the letters were brief and gave, small absent now and then, weeks passed between them. And in the long spaces the neighbor's intellect turned once more and once more to that night in the plant, when she had seen the soil opened and something mystery put inside. She started to ponder if the affliction in Thomas had started some time recently he ever set foot on the front line, for she listened from a cousin of hers who worked along the railroad that Thomas had looked pale and tired when he boarded the prepare, that his hands shook a small as he climbed the steps. She pondered if he had been carrying the weight of a few harm in him from the start when the wire at long last came saying Thomas was dead. The neighbor was not astounded, in spite of the fact that she did not say so out uproarious. The paper gave no detail, as it were, that he had kicked the bucket in benefit to the Union. No date, no put of burial, no say of wounds, and no officer came to talk with Ruth approximately his final days. Instead, she collapsed the paper once and set it aside without a tear. She went on as if small had changed in her house, and this was when the neighbor started to talk her memory to others, to begin with in a calm word on a patio at that point to the lady following to her in the seat. At church she told them of the night. Sometime recently Thomas cleared out of the moonlight on the spade of the bundle in the earth of the way. Ruth had said it was ruined. Nourishment, in spite of the fact that there was no scent and no sign of scraps on the cloth she had carried. Back inside, as soon others listened to the story and included to it a few swore They had seen Ruth buying little bottles from the traveling cellar the week, sometime recently, Thomas cleared out bottles, with no names that were wrapped in paper and slipped into her take without being appeared in the light others claimed. They had seen her talking with a stranger behind the process in spite of the fact that they might not say what was said in this way. The whisper developed from a private doubt to a story that moved through the entire of fiery debris Hollowby summer. The whisper had gotten to be a portion of the bigger cloud of rumor around. Ruth had blended with the conversation of warriors seen at her cabin, the conversation of her taking. Off the widow's dark as well, before long, the conversation of her turning. From the church, all of it bound together into a story that painted her as a lady who had freed herself of her spouse long sometime recently. The war had a chance to claim him, and the picture of her in the cultivate beneath the moon spade in hand got to be a picture that may not be deleted for those who had listened it. They saw her in their minds as the ancient neighbor had seen her the night sometime recently. The prepare came a single figure bowing moo over the soil, fixing something profound absent. Where no one was implied to lookin' from that point forward, it no longer mattered whether Thomas had kicked the bucket in fight or in his possessed bed harmed by the hand of the lady he had hitched. In the minds of the individuals of fiery remains empty. The truth had, as of now, been chosen, and no word from Ruth might have turned it back for once. That to begin with whispers talked in a put like that, it gets to be the as it were truth that things, and it will take after a title long after the individual is gone. Asterisk in October of 1865, cinder empty. Was a town still learning how to breathe after the long war the warriors had returned. A few lost appendages, a few lost companions, and a few lost their minds, and in the middle of this uneasy peace, a youthful man named Samuel Reed came back to the put he had called domestic. Since childhood he was little in outline, with dim hair and eyes that still carried the clean and smoke of fight. He strolled in an unexpected way presently with a slight limp in his cleared-out leg from a flintlock ball that had touched his thigh, but he carried himself as in spite of the fact that the war had given him reason, as in spite of the fact that the world past the town had honed him to an unused edge. The individuals of cinder empty taken note him, for he was respectful in the stores, cautious in his discourse, and continuously prepared to loan a hand with chores or errands. However, there was a disgust around him that made a few of the more seasoned ladies scowl, and the more youthful children whisper. They said he appeared fretful, as if something in him seemed not settle, and that something was not just the war, for he started to visit Ruth Carver, who lived on the edge of town in the little cabin she had kept after the passing of her spouse Thomas Carver. The cabin was humble, with a moo roof and little windows, and however, it appeared to linger bigger than it ought to for its estimate, as if it held the privileged insights of the town inside its walls. On the morning that would come to be recalled, Samuel Reed had risen early and cleared out his boarding house, strolling along the tidy cleared street with his sack of letters and packages for neighbors. He waved respectfully to the men repairing wall, to the ladies washing dress, and to the children who ran ahead and behind chasing sticks and imagining flintlocks. He carried in his intellect the list of chores he had guaranteed to do for his family and neighbors, but someplace along that course his considerations floated to Ruth Carver and to the calm of her cabin tucked close. The river's twist, he needed to talk to her around nothing and however everything, to see if she was genuinely well after the wires and rumors and months of isolation. As he neared her cabin, he taken note the shadows of the trees extending long over the yard. The disgust noticed of fallen clears out soggy soil and smoke from far-off chimneys. He called out a welcoming delicately, for he did not wish to startle anybody, and the entryway was open unlatched, as in spite of the fact that welcoming him in, however, when he ventured onto the yard there was no sound interior, spare the squeak of a pivot in the wind and the stir of the takes off over the wooden sheets. The morning sun reflected off the single candle that had been cleared out in the window, maybe by Ruth herself, but he might see no development, and after a miniature he inclined over the railing and thumped delicately and held. Up the sheets underneath his boots made no sound. He thought he listened a whisper of texture sliding over the floor. Interior, but it seemed to have been the wind. He may have envisioned. I'd thumped once more, a small louder, and called Ruth's title. She showed up abruptly in the entryway, taller than he recalled in her dark dress, her hair coiled firmly against her head. Her eyes covered up in the shadow cast by the entryway outline. She said delicately that she had not seen him some time recently. That morning that he must have been mixed up and had strolled someplace else maybe, to the edge of the waterway, maybe to the woodland past. She advertised him a glass of water and a situate on the seat exterior, but something in her tone made him waver, for he had known Ruth Carver for a long time in the week since. He returned from the war. He had observed her move through the town, unobtrusively watching the other ladies, however never joining them, and he detected that she carried a weight. No one else seemed to see that the evenings and months had squeezed upon her in ways past standard grief while they stood there, a child risen from the wood gathering kindling for the kitchen stove. The boy was little and unshod with hair tangled from the morning dew. He looked up at Samuel Reed Wide, looked at and pointed toward the yard of Ruth Carver's cabin, and said he had seen the youthful man there. He had seen him walk up the steps and thump. He had seen him talk to her through the screen of the entryway. He had seen the candle glint over the window sheets, as in spite of the fact that a shadow had moved behind it. The child demanded that Samuel had been there. However, when Samuel looked at Ruth once more, she shook her head and said, he must have been imagining that no youthful man had been there that morning, that she had opened the entryway to no one at all. Samuel felt a chill crawl down his spine, for he may not clarify what the child had seen, nor why Ruth denied it. He ventured back from the patio for a minute, uncertain if he ought to call the neighbors for offer assistance or proceed looking. And as he did, a crow cawed from the edge of the trees, and a blast of wind blew over the patio, carrying with it the blackout scent of moist soil and something else, something press or copper, that made him delay. He inclined over the railing and looked into the shadows underneath the cabin, but all he saw was haziness. The sheets appeared to tilt, as in spite of the fact that stowing away an empty space underneath, and however there was nothing to be found, nothing to demonstrate the nearness of anybody, and however the memory of the child's eyes remained settled in his intellect, as if the boy had seen the truth of the world after that morning. Samuel Reed was never seen once more by the individuals of Fiery remains empty. No one found his impressions past the yard. He never returned to the boarding house. He never talked to companions or family once more. The days passed, and the rumor started to spread through the town like a moderate moving haze that maybe Ruth Carver had taken him, maybe he had meandered into the waterway and been carried off by the streams. Maybe he had been covered up someplace in the cabin and cleared out behind. As the sheets settled and the long time passed, others came to the edge of the waterway to see if his body would rise. They looked the woods and the marshes, but nothing was found, nothing to check his section into the world but the swoon memory of a boy's wide eyes and the little engrave of boots on a wooden yard that would before long climate away. The story of Samuel Reed got to be weaved with the bigger whispers encompassing Ruth Carver, the calm dowager who had buried her spouse Thomas beneath interesting circumstances, the silver memento, the rumored harms, the daily guest, the calm that terrified the town, all of it wove together into a single string that no one challenged, completely unwind. For to talk of Ruth was to talk of the lost and the vanished, and the town had learned to hush such conversation in respectful get-togethers at church and in the advertise at the common store, in corners of rooms where as it were the shadows listened, and so Samuel Reed's vanishing remained a secret, a address that drifted over Fiery remains empty. Each harvest time, as the takes-off fell and the waterway swelled with rain, the patio where he had been final seen got to be a put, whispered approximately by children who challenged each other to approach it. The cabin itself, in the long run, fell into deterioration. The sheets spoiling the windows caked with clean and cobwebs, and however, when the wind blew through the edge of the yard, it carried the faintest resound of steps, a thump at the entryway, the development of a candle interior, in spite of the fact that the past denied to discharge its hold on the present. Neighbors talked unobtrusively of the day Samuel Reed strolled up to Ruth Carver's yard. They told the story in parts in quieted tones. In a long time to come, a few swore he had been vivacious absent by the waterway. A few swore Ruth had driven him into the house and he had basically vanished, and a few demanded the child had seen as it were shadows and envisioned the rest. However, the heart of the story never changed. The youthful trooper had strolled to that cabin and never returned, and the puzzle of where he went got to be portion of the quiet history that taken after Ruth Carver for the rest of her life, and for the town long after she had gone. In the weeks after Samuel Reed vanished, the town of Fiery remains empty, appeared to shrivel into itself, the boulevards calmer, the children cautious with their diversions, and the grown-ups attentive of talking as well uproariously of Ruth Carver and her cabin, for rumors had started to settle like clean over everything. And it was in this time that Reverend Pike, a tall man with a somber confront and eyes that had seen as well numerous distresses in his a long time, came to visit Ruth Carver. He said he came to offer supplications and consolation, and to see if anything seemed be done to bring peace to her heart, and maybe to the hearts of those in the town who whispered continually in corners approximately the lost. Youthful man, he strolled up the dusty way to the cabin that morning, the disgust still and overwhelming with the fragrance of damp takes off and smoke from removed chimneys. He thumped on the entryway 3 times and held up, whereas the sheets underneath his feet squeaked as if caution him absent. When Ruth replied, she stood there in the entryway, the same dark dress that had been her grieving clothing since Thomas passed on, firmly fitted at the midriff, her hair coiled perfectly against her head. She grinned faintly and welcomed him in with a hand that trembled, as it were, somewhat, and said she was thankful for his visit, and that she would welcome his supplications, for she had required consolation after the inconveniences of the past months. The Reverend ventured interior, noticing the tidiness of the cabin, the way the furniture was organized, and the still disgust that appeared to settle over everything like a overwhelming cover. He said a few words of consolation and inquired Ruth if there was anything upsetting her, anything that might exasperate her rest or her soul. She shook her head and talked as it were of the lost youthful man and of her distress and the inconveniences of the world. He gestured and started to supplicate unobtrusively, and as he did his eyes meandered approximately the little house waiting on the staircase that driven to the moment floor. He taken note a entryway at the beat that had been immovably nailed, closed the wood unpleasant and weathered, and however clearly avoiding get to anything lay past the outline. He inquired Ruth around the entryway, and she answered basically that it was capacity, nothing more, nothing. Of intrigued fair ancient furniture and boxes and cloths that she did not require down. Underneath the Reverend wavered. He needed to press advance, but something in her tone made him halt. He did not need to panic her or to accede, and so he bowed his head and proceeded his supplications for the misplaced youthful man, for the war dead, for the souls of those who had endured, and for the little town that appeared to carry melancholy in each brick and board. After he cleared out the cabin, Reverend Pike strolled gradually back along the street toward the center of Cinder Empty. He may feel the eyes of neighbors upon him, as if they had taken after him in soul. He thought almost the entryway upstairs. The straightforward clarification that it was capacity did not sit effortlessly with him. Something almost, it felt, off base, as in spite of the fact that the wood itself held a mystery and the nails squeezed against it with calm request of keeping something covered up, he attempted to expel it from his intellect, telling himself that a dowager had a right to security in her claimed domestic, that a person's melancholy frequently took unusual shapes, and however he may not shake the unease that had started to crawl along his spine like a cold draft too. Days afterward, he found himself talking to townsfolk accumulated in the common store for supplies and discussion. He was a man of measured words, and the individuals trusted him to talk with care and truth. He said unobtrusively that he had listened something in the cabin, something bizarre, suppressed commotions coming from behind the upstairs entryway clamors that he seemed not get it clearly at to begin with. He thought it might be the wind moving through splits in the roof, or maybe in creature caught someplace, for he had seen rats in other homes and mice in the horse shelters, but the sounds were sporadic, delicate pounds and dragging sounds, and they had the weight of something lively, something being moved carefully or battling to move on its possess. He did not denounce Ruth straightforwardly. He, as it were, said that he had listened these commotions, whereas advertising supplications, and that it was upsetting to him as a man of the cloth and as somebody who had served this assembly for a long time. The townsfolk tuned in with riveted consideration, their eyes moving from one to the other, a few gesturing in concern, a few scowling with doubt, a few clutching the fixes of their cook's garments or the straps of their caps and whispering to themselves around what it may cruel, and what was covered up in that bolted room above. Reverend talked in measured tones, telling them to consider what was inconspicuous in their claim hearts and homes, for the world held numerous riddles, and a few privileged insights were not implied to be uncovered. However, he seemed not cover up the tremor in his voice that sold out his claim stress he depicted. The sound of pounds, like somebody moving overwhelming boxes, or maybe the dragging of a body along the floorboards. The way the swoon resound carried down the stairs. The way the discuss itself appeared to move when the commotions happened. He described that he had tuned in long sufficient to know that the sound did not come from the wind or from conventional creatures. It was considered measured and bizarre. It proposed an earnest, limited, however dynamic, lively, however covered up, and the simple thought of what it might be sent a shudder through the listener. Served the taking. After days, the rumor spread like fierce blaze. The children whispered to each other as they ran errands. The ladies examined it discreetly, whereas washing dishes or collapsing clothing, the men looked toward Ruth's cabin when passing and imagined not to take note the boarded entryway and the shadows past the windows. The town had, as of now, learned to talk cautiously of Ruth Carver. She was a dowager as well, calm as well, composed as well, evacuated from the standard designs of melancholy, and presently the Reverend's words gave weight to the fear that had continuously drifted around her. She had continuously been untouchable in inconspicuous ways, and the bolted room got to be an image of everything the townsfolk might not get it, everything they might not see, and everything that might have slipped through the splits of respectability and morality. Some evenings the Reverend himself seemed not rest, considering of the sounds he had listened, considering of the entryway nailed closed, considering of the conceivable outcomes that lay past the wood and the nails and the quiet. He envisioned lifting the sheets one by one and seeing a figure, twisted or moving or sitting in the shadows. He envisioned a room filled with boxes and furniture, and nothing more. And however, in the back of his intellect, he seemed not expel the memory of suppressed pounds and delicate draggings, as in spite of the fact that the exceptionally floorboards whispered of a few mystery kept for decades. He implored for direction and for clarity, and however the unease did not take off him, the memory taken after him into his sermons, into his strolls along the soil roads, and into his calm minutes by the stream, where he some of the time delayed to consider the lives of those around him, and the covered-up burdens they carrieth. Townsfolk started to observe Ruth with more noteworthy concentrated after his declaration. They looked from windows, they waited close the edge of her property. They whispered and guessed, and however they drawn closer with caution, for she was known to be able of measured words and sharp answers, and the Reverend's notoriety gave trustworthiness to their fears. He did not denounce her straightforwardly. He, as it were, shared what he had listened, and however that was sufficient to bend the cut of doubt more. profound into the texture of cinder empty, and so the cabin with its nailed closed entryway got to be a central point of the town's unease, a put where creative energy met rumor and rumor met fear, and for the rest of that harvest time and into the long winters that taken after the echoes of suppressed clamors. Behind the closed entryway frequented not, as it were, the reverend, but all those who challenged to consider what might be covered up with Einand. In spite of the fact that time would pass and the seasons would turn, Ruth Carver's cabin would stay, with the bolted upstairs room an image of puzzle and quiet, and in the minds of the townsfolk, each squeak of the floor, each blast of wind against the dividers, each shadow cast by the moon got to be an update that there were truths and fiery remains, empty, that were kept carefully out of locate, and that indeed a man of the cloth, a reverend with confidence and reason, might listen clamors that recommended more than the world would permit them to see, or get at asterisk one moonless night the town of cinder empty was calm nearly unnaturally, so the roads purge of their normal flurry. The wind still as if holding up for something to happen, a bunch of men chosen that the time had come to go up. Against Ruth Carver almost the whispers, the rumors. The bizarre happenings that had frequented the town for months, they assembled unobtrusively in the shadows close. The edge of the woods past the center of town, their faces set with assurance, their hands grasping lights, the light swinging marginally. From the pressure in their arms they talked in quieted voices, for fear that anybody catch them, and plotted to approach the cabin at the distant edge of town, that little staying, with the windows covered and the entryway immovably closed and nailed. In a few places, however, continuously appearing to observe them back, as if it had its possess. Ice strolled in a line down the dusty street, cautious to step as it were on delicate soil, and dodge the free stones that might sell out their nearness. The lights cast long, glinting shadows over the ground, the branches of the trees coming to out like skeletal hands over them. The disgust was cold and clammy, carrying the scent of damp takes. Often smoke from far-off chimneys they whispered among themselves, reviewing the stories of lost men, of suppressed clamors from the upstairs room, of silver lockets found by the stream. Each story more terrifying than the final, and each story reinforcing the resolve to see for themselves what was happening. Interior Ruth Carver's home. As they neared the cabin the wind moved, and a sense of unease settled over them, heavier than the obscurity, heavier than the night itself. They stopped at the edge of the yard, a few swearing. They listened. Development. Interior a delicate rearrange of steps, a whisper that did not have a place to the wind, the lights weaving in their hands, casting light on the sheets of the patio that were distorted with age and shadow. They whispered supplications to themselves, and to anything God might tune into, unfaltering their nerves, and pushed forward toward the door. Ruth Carver showed up some time recently, them as they come to the steps, calm, grinning, peaceful, as in spite of the fact that she had been anticipating them all along. Her eyes glinted faintly in the dim light. The men solidified for a minute. At the locate of her, she was taller than they recollected, her dark dress streaming delicately, her hair coiled flawlessly against her head, her hands purged and still, and however holding the weight of specialists that none of them might challenge. She said, essentially in a voice that carried clearly through the night, "You ought to not be here." The words were calm, delicate indeed. Welcoming, however, they struck the men with, and concentrated that none of them may have anticipated of the men. Ventured forward, requesting to know what she had done to Samuel Reed, what was in the bolted room upstairs, why the whispers had spread so distant and wide. Ruth's grin did not flounder. She did not raise her voice. She, as it were, tilted her head marginally, and said once more that they ought to not be there, that it was unsafe to barge into places. They did not get it, that a few things were implied to stay inconspicuous. The men rearranged their feet, a few attempting to assemble strength, others as of now feeling a chill creep along their spines, their lights swinging sporadically casting long, trembling shadows over the yard and the cabin dividers. The night appeared to fix around them as if the obscurity itself were tuning in and holding up for a choice to be Medethan. Something happened that none of the men may clarify and no one would ever talk of once more. The disgust moved all of a sudden, a weight against their chests, as in spite of the fact that the room behind the entryway and the lady herself had filled the space with a nearness, imperceptible but evident. The lights flashed savagely, a few diminishing to close haziness, a few flaring, shinning for a brief minute, and at that point quenching completely. One man swore he listened a murmur of vibration that appeared to come from the dividers, the sheets, the exceptionally soil underneath their feet. Another felt the hairs on his neck stand on conclusion, as if a few inconspicuous hand had passed gently over his skin. Others felt a cold surge of disgust or the brush of something that was not there, a weight of fear so strongly that the intellect seemed not enroll clearly what was genuine and what was imagined. And at that point, as all of a sudden, as it started, it was gone. The men turned their eyes toward Ruth and found her still standing there, calm, grinning, quiet as some time recently, and however the disgust around her had moved. Something almost her had ended up bigger than some time. Recently, the nearness that had filled the patio presently appeared to radiate from her alone. The men said nothing. They may not talk. The words would not come. They brought down their lights unwittingly, their hands trembling. They ventured in reverse, one by one, and at that point turned and fled into the haziness down the street, past the trees, past the open areas, past the few lights still burning in other homes. They ran without looking back, the sound of their claim, breathing the beating of their hearts, the drone of their fear, keeping them moving until they come to the security of the town center afterward. They would never talk of the occasion once more at slightest, not in detail, not to one another, not to the reverend, not to the chairman or the sheriff. The as it were thing that remained in memory was the picture of Ruth Carver standing at the entryway, calm, grinning, quiet, her eyes flickering faintly in the dim light, and the feeling that a few imperceptible constraint had touched them, a few specialists past human understanding that had requested submission and claimed their hush. They were pale-faced the another morning when seen by neighbors, their hands shaking, somewhat their voices rough or truant when talked to, and the few who attempted to relate what had happened found that the words slipped from their tongues as if taboo by a few concealed hand. The town itself took note in spite of the fact that nothing was ever recorded authoritatively. The children whispered to one another when they passed the cabin, telling stories of the night the men had gone and not returned with metal sufficient as it were to look from the trees. The ladies crossed themselves noiselessly as they strolled by the edge of the property. The men dodged the street, closed her cabin inside and out, and in the a long time that taken after at whatever point somebody specified Ruth Carver. It was with a cautious bringing down of the voice, a look to the shadows, acknowledgement that she had held control over that night, and that the memory of it was sufficient to keep interest in check. And so the night got to be legend among the individuals of fiery debris, empty, a night that was talked of as it were in parts the correct subtle elements never committed to memory, the sensation of fear and amazement remaining the picture of Ruth, calm, grinning, peaceful, standing at the entryway, the unexplainable weight and the escaping men, the lights swinging, the shadows moving, the wind carrying privileged insights, all of it woven into the texture of the town's memory as a caution, a puzzle, and a caution to any who might look for it across the edge of that cabin, or the calm specialist of Ruth Carver herself, and for the rest of her life and long after her passing. The yard and the entryway got to be an image of control, inconspicuous and unchallenged, to update that a few experiences take off their stamp, not in stories told, but in the hush and the trembling that takes after asterisk. In December, the mornings in Fiery remains empty, were sharp and still, the ice clinging to the edges of the wooden wall and the long grass Along the streets, the stream running moderate and thick with the chill of winter, the townsfolk, wrapped in shawls and coats, moving discreetly approximately their chores, carrying buckets of water or bundles of kindling for the stoves and hearths, the wind, moo and unfaltering, carrying the scent of damp soil and far-off smoke, and on one such morning Ruth Carver was seen clearing out her cabin, moving down the dusty street toward the ancient quarry, her figure dull against the pale light of first light, an expansive trunk clutched immovably in her hands, the wood of it ancient and worn. The press groups holding it together, sparkling faintly in the morning light. She strolled with relentless reason, her dark dress brushing against the ice-tipped grass, her skirts influencing tenderly in the slight wind, her hair coiled flawlessly. Against her head, the diagram of her figure, peaceful and consider, and however by one means or another carrying the weight of the months of privileged insights that had accumulated around her title, since the vanishing of Samuel Reed and the whispers of the bolted upstairs room of suppressed commotions and vanished men and the showdown on the patio with the lights of the panicked townsfolk, all of it squeezed upon her however she moved, as if guided by a few inconspicuous constraint to the edge of the quarry where the soil had been emptied, absent over the decades by hands and machines, and time itself, as she strolled, a rancher on horseback, was traveling along the same street. He was a man usual to rising early, tending areas and checking wall and bringing in the creatures from the marsh pastures. He taken note. Her, at a remove to begin with, as a dull figure against the ice at that point, saw the trunk she carried, the measure and weight of it clear in the way she held it with both arms squeezed to her body, her shoulders set and relentless. He called out a welcoming and advertised help, his voice carrying delicately over the cold morning discuss. He inquired if she would permit him to offer assistance with the overwhelming trunk, to make the work simpler for her and maybe to share the burden. However, she shook her head solidly, her expression calm, peaceful. Her eyes settled forward on the street and the removed twist where the quarry opened. Her voice, delicate but unfaltering, told him she required no offer assistance, that she may oversee alone, and that he ought to proceed on his way. She did not raise her voice, she did not glower, she basically looked ahead and moved with ponder pace, her steps unhurried but steadfast, as in spite of the fact that the choice had been made long sometime recently that to begin with light of day, break touched the ice-tipped grass, observed her for a minute longer as he encouraged his horse ahead toward the twist in the street, and by the time he come to that point where the trees bended around the way and the quarry came into sea, she was gone. The trunk vanished, the dim figure of Ruth Carver no longer unmistakable against the pale winter light, as in spite of the fact that the soil had gulped her entirety, as in spite of the fact that the wind itself had carried her absent, and the agriculturist stopped his horse, uncertain whether to call out or proceed on for fear of aggravating a few concealed nearness. He looked toward the quarry where the soil expanded and the shadows lay long and cold. He looked along the edges, checking for impressions or signs of section, but the ground was smooth, untouched, and quiet, and the ice remained unbroken. The news of her vanishing spread gradually. To begin with, for the townsfolk were cautious in talking of Ruth Carver. They had learned over the months and a long time that to talk as well openly was to welcome unease and to draw consideration. To the shadows that waited around her title, however, by late morning whispers had started to swell through fiery remains empty. The metal forger stopped with his pound mid-swing and specified seeing her moving down the street with the trunk. The merchant brought down his head as he stacked tins and gestured to the story. The teacher told the more seasoned children, who had been holding up for lessons, that she had been seen and that she was gone. The stories heaped upon one another, each including a weight of fear and riddle to the occasion, each describing, affirming that Ruth Carver had strolled to the edge of the ancient quarry, carrying a trunk, and that not one or the other, the lady nor the question, had returned search parties. were shaped in the long run little bunches of men and boys with lights and apparatuses wandering toward the quarry to see if they seemed to discover the way she had taken the edge of the cliff, the slant down into the emptied stone, the banks of the waterway that ran underneath. However, they found nothing, not impression, not a scrape in the ice, not the smallest check of entry. The quarry itself noiseless and immovable, the trunk no place in the low light, the ice untouched, and the wind carrying, as it were, the blackout sound of the stream and the removed cry of a fowl, and the sense of vacancy that appeared to develop with each step they took in their look. They called her title, their voices resounding against the stone dividers of the quarry and bouncing back from the removed slopes. However, no reply came, as it were hush, and the whisper of the wind through the desolate trees. Townsfolk hypothesized unendingly almost what had gotten to be of Ruth Carver and the trunk that had went with her to the edge of the quarry. A few said she had covered up it in a mystery section underneath the stones. Others swore she had been taken by a few, concealed drive that had held up calmly for the minute to claim her. A few accepted she had strolled into the stream with the trunk squeezed to her chest and vanished underneath the ice-cold water. Others whispered darker, conceivable outcomes, that the things she had carried with her, the insider facts of the bolted room, the bizarre events of vanished men and suppressed clamors, had at last caught up with her, and that she had vanished to elude the results of long-kept secrets, and none might say which adaptation was genuine, for no one had seen her once more. No follow of the overwhelming wood and press trunk was ever found. The soil appeared to have gulped both the lady and the protest, and the stream ran cold and uninterested, carrying, absent any proof that might have clarified what had happened that early winter dawnin'. The days that taken after the edge of the quarry got to be a put of calm love and fear. The children challenged each other to approach it, but never waited. The grown-ups talked in quieted tones, maintaining a strategic distance from its shadows. And the extent of street driving to it, the memory of Ruth Carver, strolling intentionally with the trunk squeezed to her chest, the calm tranquility of her expression, the refusal of offer assistance from the passing agriculturist, waited in the minds of all who had seen her. It got to be portion of the legend of fiery remains, empty, a story told with cautious bringing down of voices, a story of vanishing and riddle that no one may fathom, the non-appearance of impressions, the untouched ice, the noiseless waterway, all combined to propose that the conventional rules of the world no longer connected to her, that she had moved past the reach of the town and maybe past the reach of time itself, and so Ruth Carver vanished from fiery debris, empty, completely, taking off behind, as it were, the memory of the dull figure in the early light, carrying an overwhelming trunk toward the obscure, the disgust carrying her entry. The street purged once more, and the town cleared out to wrestle with theory and whispers, and the waiting sense that a few insider facts are not implied to be revealed, and a few individuals move through the world carrying their burdens alone and vanishing when they select, without caution, without follow, and the ancient quarry remained noiseless, with, as it were, the ice and the wind and the resound of the steps that would never return. And the secret of Ruth Carver and her overwhelming trunk got to be one of the enduring shadows of fiery debris, empty, a shadow that would frequent the town for eras. After Ruth Carver vanished from fiery remains empty, the town of Elmbrook appeared to overlay in on itself, as in spite of the fact that the exceptionally soil had gulped the recollections of her presence. The boulevards that had once reverberated with the delicate squeak of her strides and the intermittent clatter of her chores presently carried, as it were, the wind and the removed cawing of crows. The little cabin where she had lived on the edge of town was boarded up with harsh boards nailed unevenly over the windows and entryway, the sheets themselves weathered rapidly with ice and rain and wind. And however they appeared to hold something interior, as in spite of the fact that the wood recalled what had been inside, in spite of the fact that no one challenged to enter to test its quiet. The chimney no longer smoked. The plant cleared out to the wild, and the weeds developed tall and hardened in the cold earth church in the center of town acted with rise to meticulousness as if Ruth Carver had never been numbered among the assemblage. The records were modified, her title scratched from the pages, the ink still faintly obvious in a few places, but something else eradicated and supplanted with a clear space, as if the recorders who kept up the logbooks had been requested to evacuate any follow of her. There were no notices in the sermons, no supplications advertised for her soul, no references in the readings on Sunday mornings. The priests and older folks talked carefully when her title came up, and when they did, they talked as in spite of the fact that she were an apparition as of now withdrawn from memory. A few whispered that it was to anticipate distress, a few that it was a discipline for the town to disregard, that a few insider facts are as well perilous to keep lively in discussion, and a few that it was basically a viable degree to ensure the children and the rest of the assembly from interest that might lead them to places and contemplations way better cleared out undisturbed in. The children taken note and felt the non-appearance as if an undetectable hand had squeezed upon them to keep calm, to tread gently in their claim creative energies. They had seen her strolling in the early light, carrying the overwhelming trunk toward the quarry. They had seen the dim cabin entryways and the windows reflecting nothing, and however a few had listened stories whispered by more seasoned kin and the rancher who had passed her in the street, and by the men who had gone to the yard in the light and returned pale and quiet. The grown-ups cautioned them solidly not to talk of her, not to inquire questions, not to indeed think her title out loud for fear that she listen you, they said, as in spite of the fact that Ruth Carver herself might still move concealed through the town, tuning in for interest and meandering contemplations. And there were evenings when the children lay wakeful in bed, envisioning shadows slipping along the dividers and the delicate squeak of floorboards that had a place to no one and however felt familiar. Town itself moved carefully around her non-attendance, the common store supplied unobtrusively, as in spite of the fact that no one would require to examine her nearness at the cash-in list. The metal forger worked in his shop with a more profound center pounding and twisting press and steel in cadence with his pulse and in his intellect. The edges of fear and theory, as in spite of the fact that a few undetectable weight hung over the town, and each nail driven, each step taken, was in portion to dodge pulling in her consideration from wherever she might wait in the spaces between the obvious and the covered up. The town committee met in quieted tones to examine repairs to the street, close her property, the evacuation of congested weeds, the support of wall, and the upkeep of the way to the waterway and the quarry, all measures to guarantee that interest would not entice the unwary into crossing boundaries way better cleared out alone. Stories around Ruth Carver got to be legend in spite of the fact that they were never completely talked out loud, a portion of the town's old stories, told in parts on the edge of firelight in kitchens when the wind-shaken screens and trees moaned against the window panes. The senior citizens talked of the vanished dowager with care and gravity, an update to children to take after the rules, to regard boundaries, to maintain a strategic distance from meandering considerations, and to tread discreetly in the world, as in spite of the fact that each shadow might contain a mystery watcher. A few claimed that on uncommon evenings the wind through the purge cabin sounded like strides climbing the stairs to the bolted room, or the delicate pound of a trunk set down on the floor, and that if an individual tuned in closely sufficient, they might listen her voice in a whisper, a cautionary word, a update that memory is delicate, and that non-attendance can be as effective as presence hath physical. Updates of her life were gone, her furniture sold or given her materials dispersed among the neighbors, her cultivate recovered by weeds and ice, and the sheets nailed over her cabin were both a boundary and a marker, the boundaries of hush in the town. Her title, evacuated from church records, got to be more than deletion, it got to be an instruction. a command to live, as in spite of the fact that Ruth Carver had never strolled among them to evacuate from memory the weight of her nearness. The questions that taken after her the fear and interest that had clung to those who saw her and touched those who experienced her in any way, and the children in specific learned early to comply, for they were cautioned over and over in whispers and looks and deflected eyes that interest might summon results past understanding, and that to talk of her out loud might draw her consideration to their homes or dream sand. So Elmbrook moved forward in calm compliance, the grown-ups carrying on with chores and administration, and the children keeping cautious observe over their possessed words and contemplations. The wind proceeded to clear through the boulevards and the purge areas. The crows circled sluggishly over the boarded cabin. The church chimes rang on plan. However, the space once possessed by Ruth Carver remained suspended in memory and non-appearance, as if the town collectively held its breath. The streets driving to her house and the quarry were crossed, as it were, when fundamental the stream ran cold and clear past the edge of the property untouched. The trees along the way holding their possessed shadows, and the sense that Ruth Carver waited in soul indeed as her body had vanished, a nearness that required caution and regard, and the understanding that a few secrets are protected not in memory but in cautious silence over the long time. The story endured in parts and half-whispers in the minds of those who recollected, and in the caution stories told to children at night, the cabin steadily rotted, however still held its sheets and still appeared to check a put, where the world was diverse, where the standard rules did not apply, where non-attendance itself carried meaning and specialists the individuals of Elmbrook learned to live around it, to treat the space as sacrosanct and unsafe. The memory of Ruth Carver and the instruction not to talk of her or to envision her as well closely got to be a portion of everyday life, a run-the-show fortified by propensity and fear, and the town moved on, whereas never genuinely letting go of the lady who had vanished, and cleared out them with the implicit command to disregard, however, to keep in mind, and to comply in silence. And so Ruth Carver's life in Elmbrook finished not with certainty, but with cautious exclusion. The house boarded up, the church records cleared, the children cautioned the grown-ups, maintaining a strategic distance from say, and the memory of her got to be a shadow over the town, and nearness and non-appearance a lesson and a riddle that would persevere for eras, and the wind over the ice-cleared areas carried on through the purged lanes and the boarded windows, a update that she had once been there, and that indeed in vanishing she remained a constraint that molded the lives of those who challenged to keep in mind. *5 A long time had passed since Ruth Carver vanished from Elmbrook, and in that time the town had settled into a cautious schedule of shirking and quiet. The boarded cabin at the edge of town had remained untouched, the wood weathered and gray, the windows dusty and dark, the cultivate congested with weeds and ice-tipped grass, the wind blowing through the purge trees, carrying the fragrance of soil and cold waterway water. The children cautioned not to talk her title, the grown-ups discreetly imagining she had never existed, and however the memory of her waited like a shadow cast over the lanes, the way to the ancient quarry congested and untraveled. The church records long since eradicated of her title, and her nearness limited to whispers and half-recollected stories, and at that point one night in late harvest time, when the discuss had taken the nibble of early winter, the town stirred to smoke twisting against the sky, the scent of fire floating over housetops and through the boulevards. The cabin at the edge of town was on fire, the blazes climbing eagerly along the sheets, licking the overhang and twisting out the windows, the color of fire shinning against the dull night, the warm rising in waves that may be felt from the street as men and ladies rushed toward the gleam, carrying buckets and covers and anything devices they might discover to contain the inferno. However, there was no clear source of the fire, no light cleared out carelessly burning, no start from the hearth. The burst appeared to have started from no place, and however it seethed with a control that recommended purposeful and designators accumulated. At a cautious separate, a few clutching coats against the cold wind, a few holding children in their arms, a few talking in quieted tones and others noiseless. Totally their eyes settled on the cabin as the flares expended the wood and glass, the roof collapsing in stages with boisterous crashes of chipping bars and the smoke turning thick and dark against the pale moonlight. The fire licked the trees encompassing the property, sending sparkles flying into the night, and the wind carried the scent of burning wood and the blackout fragrance of something metallic or iron-like that made the skin prickle on the backs of the necks of those observing. The grown-ups whispered among themselves, conjecturing around what may have caused it, a few claiming that maybe a lightning strike had lighted the dry sheets, a few demanding that a carelessly cleared-out light must have been to fault. However, no one might concur, and the fire appeared as well intense to be accidentalist. The blazes climbed higher, the witnesses started to talk in voices, trembling with fear and amazement, for shapes had started to show up in the windows of the cabin, dim traces moving with the light of the fire behind them, the sheets distorted and turned with the warm casting shadows that moved over the dividers. The shapes showed up at times to be tall, at times hunkered moo, a few moving gradually, others hurrying with a sudden escalated over the outline of the windows, and one of the figures most witnesses concurred appeared unmistakable, the outline of a lady, tall and balanced, her hair coiled firmly against her head. Her position commonplace, her nearness commanding indeed in shadow, and separate the locate made numerous falter back in stun, a few clutching at one another, a few turning absent, incapable to observe, and however incapable to tear their eyes from the scene. Men climbed steps to attempt to drench the flares with water, but the fire stood up to each exertion. As if it had a will of its claim, the sheets that were moist in places burned with new vigor, the windows shattering but still holding the shapes inside the gleam, the roof collapsing in areas, uncovering impressions of dim development, the smoke carrying interesting designs over the night sky, as if telling a story as it were. Those adjusted to it may see a few swore. They listened, whispers carried on the wind over the crackle and thunder of the fireworks, delicate and far off, as in spite of the fact that coming from interior the flares, a few swore they saw the trunk that Ruth had carried to the quarry show up among the flotsam and jetsam moving over the floor, as in spite of the fact that guided by undetectable hands, and the shapes in the windows moved and glinted in ways that proposed acknowledgment of the watchers outside. And however, in spite of the free for all of development, the fire may not be contained until it had burned through, totally clearing out, as it were, smoldering fiery remains and charred wood, the cabin diminished to an purge outline of bars and rubble. The chimney toppled onto the ground, the sheets turned and darkened, and the windows long since smashed, the disgust thick with smoke and the scent of burned soil and charred timber. The town stood quietly for a long minute, retaining the pulverization and the bizarre locate of shapes that appeared to have moved inside the fire. The grown-ups whispered unobtrusively among themselves for fear of talking. As well, boisterously, the children stowed away behind skirts and coats, and little hands clutched firmly to the edge of furniture, and the memory of Ruth Carver and the outline in the windows got to be another layer of legend included to the story that had started with her vanishing a long time before. No one claimed to have set the fire, no one conceded to carrying a light or striking a coordinate or clearing out a stoveland. The specialists examined in their claim way, inquiring questions and looking the grounds and the remains, but found nothing conclusive, no fingerprints, no proof, no instrument or start that may clarify the blast. The witnesses concurred as it were on the shapes and the moving shapes in the windows, and the unmistakable impression that Ruth Carver herself had some way or another showed up one last time, sometime recently, vanishing totally from the town she had frequented and molded with her nearness for a long time. The individuals carried the story forward in hush and whispers and in cautious evasion of the edges of the ancient property. The fire burned and expended, however, too uncovered a nearness that had never completely cleared out, and that no one seemed deny in the taking. After days, the town moved cautiously around the remains of the cabin, the fiery debris cold and gray, the sheets decreased to parts, the establishment checked, as it were, by darkened stone and distorted timbers. The way to the quarry still congested and untrodden, the wind carrying swoon whispers and echoes of the night. Of the fire the children cautioned once more not to talk her title for fear that she listened them. The grown-ups shared cautious looks and half-talked, expressions strengthening the idea that Ruth Carver had returned one last time and that her control and secret had not lessened indeed in non-attendance indeed in passing, and that the town must proceed to watch boundaries, to talk in quiet, and to regard the unknown over. A long time the story of the fire at Ruth Carver's house got to be portion of the texture of Elmbrook and cinder empty, a story whispered to children, a cautionary story to remind individuals that a few habitations persevere past vanishing, and that a few secrets are stamped not by rationale or reason, but by shadows and shapes seen in fire and smoke and reflected in memory. The outline in the windows of the burning house remained in the minds of those who had seen it, a update of the lady who had strolled with a trunk to the quarry, who had gone up against the men on the yard, who had vanished from the town without clarification, and who had returned one last time in fire and shadow. A nearness that requested regard indeed in non-attendance, and that molded the town for generations. And so Ruth Carver's story finished not one or the other with certainty, nor with closure. The cabin burned to the ground, the shapes in the windows, seen by numerous, however claimed by none. The outline unmistakable, the puzzle protected, and escalates the town cleared. Out to live with her memory, the whispers, the notices, and the understanding that a few individuals cannot be overlooked, and a few habitations wait past life, past vanishing, past clarification, and the wind over the fiery remains and ice-tipped areas, carried on through the lanes and purgeways. The update of Ruth Carver and the fire that uncovered her one final time asterisk over. The decades after Ruth Carver vanished and the cabin burned to the ground, the ancient quarry at the edge of fiery remains empty remained, a put of calm unease, the way congested and misleading, the slant soak and rough the trees, casting long shadows over the solidified soil in winter and dappled light in summer. Travelers passing closed the quarry frequently detailed unusual sightings, shapes seen in the outskirts of vision, shadows that appeared as well pondered to be windblown takes off or branches, influencing in the breeze, the disgust carrying a chill not totally clarified by the climate, and in those minutes, a sense of being observed, a weight squeezing against the intellect as if inconspicuous eyes, taken after each step, each development, and more than once a pale lady showed up, strolling gradually along the way, the figure tall and lean, her pose inflexible. However agile her clothing, obsolete the skirts and bodice, dark and firm the coiled hair, unmistakably styled as Ruth Carver had worn it. The figure moving with reason, as in spite of the fact that she had a goal known, as it were, to herself, and the shadows around her sometimes she carried a light, the light swinging delicately but casting long, sharp shadows over the rocks and trees, the gleam enlightening her highlights fair sufficient to make her eyes obvious, and in the remove it appeared that her expression was calm and knowing, as in spite of the fact that she recognized the traveler sometime recently, indeed seeing them clearly. The discuss around her carried a swoon fragrance of moist soil and press, and the swoon whisper of ancient wood and smoke that appeared to take after her along the way. A few witnesses swore they may see a trunk dragging behind her over the ice-tipped grass or along the rugged stones, as in spite of the fact that she had carried it for a long time, and however it never wore her down or moderated her pace. The nearness of the figure propelled wonderment in a few and dread in others, and all who saw her felt the same calm request that she was not to be drawn nearer or addressed lightly on. Man traveling from a neighboring town reviewed riding along the way fair sometime recently sunset his horse. Uneasy and stamping as if detecting a nearness past locate, he turned a corner, where the way contracted and saw her strolling toward him, carrying the light and an overwhelming trunk, her skirts influencing somewhat, and her hair coiled flawlessly against her head, he felt. The hairs on the back of his neck rise as the disgust appeared to develop heavier with each step she took. He moderated his horse impulses, his eyes settled on her figure, and in that minute the lady raised her head and talked in a voice delicate but carrying clearly over the remove. Do the town still keep in mind? She inquired the address calmly, delicately, however, with an specialist that made his heart pound and his throat fix, as in spite of the fact that the words themselves carried control and weight and meaning past comprehension. He attempted to reply, but found his voice gone, his tongue overwhelming, and stuck to the roof of his mouth as if a few inconspicuous constraint had rendered him unable of discourse. The light swung in her hand, and the gleam reflected in her pale confront the eyes dull and fathomless, and for a long minute they respected one another in quiet and understanding. Sometime recently, she turned and proceeded strolling down the way toward the quarry, vanishing behind rocks and trees, as in spite of the fact that gulped by the soil itself of their travelers told comparative stories over the a long time, portraying the same pale lady in obsolete clothing, carrying a light some of the time, dragging a trunk over the ice-tipped grass or over the rocks along the edge of the quarry. The stories shifted marginally with remove and memory, however, all shared the same sense of wonderment and unease. The lady moved gradually, however, intentionally, as, in spite of the fact that, unconcerned with the section of time or the nearness of those who might watch her, the discuss around, her frequently cold and still the feathered creatures calmed, the wind dropping absent, as if the scene itself recognized her section, the trunk continuously show or seen in movement, the light casting long and faltering shadows that appeared to hold shapes of individuals or things long gone, and the address do the town still keep in mind, rehashed in some cases noiselessly in the minds of the spectators now, and then out loud in the gentlest whispers that appeared to carry back to the figure, as in spite of the fact that she seemed listen contemplations, and eagerly as clearly as words talked aloud. Folks passing through the region started to change their courses. The quarry got to be a put of calm caution, a point of interest of stories told at hotels and bars along the way, a update to regard boundaries, and the past a put where travelers might see more than they caught on and all. Who saw the pale lady detailed a profound sense of history and distress and carefulness, as in spite of the fact that Ruth Carver herself had ended up a gatekeeper or superintendent of memory, guaranteeing that the town and those who recollected did so with care and regard the locating of the light, or the trunk, or the cautious way she moved along. The way ingraining a love that waited long after she vanished from sea, and the memory of that experience remained with the witness like a shadow clinging to the mind over the decades. The stories collected and were rehashed in quieted tones to children and newcomers, to the town travelers and vagabonds passing through the range, talked of shapes seen behind trees along the way of rocks, outlined against the moonlight, and the pale lady carrying a light and dragging a trunk that appeared outlandish in its weight and frame, and continuously the address do the town still keep in mind, as if she were testing the living, the passing eras, to see if the memory of her and of her vanishing and of the burned cabin and the misplaced trunk and the vanished men had persevered over time, or if it had blurred into hush and absent-mindedness. The woods themselves got to be charged with that memory, the branches bending in the wind, casting shadows like coming to hands, the way winding over rocks and ice-tipped grass-carrying travelers along a line where past and show collided, and the nearness of the pale lady was an update that a few riddles and a few habitations cannot be deleted by time or separate or absence. And so Ruth Carver proceeded to move through the edges of fiery remains, empty and Elmbrook in the eyes and memory of those who passed closed the quarry, a figure ageless and frequenting, a gatekeeper of privileged insights, a examiner of memory carrying, her light and dragging her trunk, guaranteeing that the story held on, guaranteeing that her nearness remained in the minds of those who might something else disregard her. The travelers talked in quieted voices to one another, sharing stories of the pale lady, the light flashing in their creative impulses, the trunk, overwhelming and dull, the skirts and coiled hair unmistakable, and the words that frequented them the town still recalls, rehashed in thought or whisper, a state that carried weight over time and space, interfacing the living to the vanished, and the memory of Ruth Carver, persevering as long as the wind cleared through the trees. And the way to the quarry remained a put of shadow and story, and over decades the pale lady got to be legend, a nearness strolling the streets at the edge of memory, and the living understanding that a few individuals cannot be contained by non-appearance or passing, that a few habitations persevere to remind the town to keep in mind that a few questions are interminable and a few shadows cannot be chased absent, and the quarry got to be a put of story, of caution, of wonder, where travelers seen a light and a trunk and a figure and listened in quiet or whisper the words do the town still keep in mind, and carried them forward as portion of the living memory of Ruth Carver and the puzzles that taken after her. And the wind through the trees carried her nearness like a breath along the way, along the stones, along the edge of the waterway that streamed moderate and cold, and the legend held on forming minds and hearts, and caution for eras. Asterisk in 1998, a little bunch of novice history specialists arrived in fiery debris empty, decided to reveal the last resting put of Ruth Carver. Their intrigued, started by decades of stories, whispers, and the persevering legend of the Pale Lady, closed the ancient quarry. They came prepared with scoops, metal finders, notepads, cameras, and electric lamps. Their fervor blended with a profound sense of unease as they drawn nearer the edge of town, the disgust cold and fresh, carrying the swoon fragrance of damp soil and rotting. Clears out the way to the quarry, congested and limit with ice-tipped grass and brambles brushing against their legs, the stream running moderate and gray next to the rocks, the wind through the trees carrying the echoes of stories told over eras of men, ladies, and children who had seen shadows, shapes, and development along the edge of the ancient property. They halted briefly to look at the location of Ruth Carver's cabin, presently long since burned to the ground, the charred establishment darkened and bent, and the ground littered with little parts of fiery remains and twisted wood, the disgust still carrying faintly the memory of fire smoke and something metallic that set their nerves on edge. They took notes and photos, moving carefully along the way that driven toward the quarry, the rocks smooth with ice, the soil uneven underneath the wind, stirring branches over, and the shadows long and bending as the sun sank toward the skyline, casting the whole scene into a dim and frequenting. Shine the bunch talked in quieted voices, their words cautious and think mindful that they were trespassing into a put soaks in decades of legend and fear and memory. After a few minutes of cautious looking, they chose an area of soil close the edge of the quarry, thought to be the most likely resting put for Ruth Carver. They started to burrow gradually, taking turns with scoops and hands, cautious not to exasperate anything, pointlessly mindful that they were barging in on a put as of now overwhelming with history and story. The soil was difficult and stuffed with ice and little stones and parts of plant roots, and as the sun plunged lower, the shadows extended longer over the ground, giving the location and indeed more inauspicious disgust. The gathered delayed, habitually wiping sweat from their brows in spite of the chill, their breaths unmistakable in the disgust, and their hearts dashing with the pressure of disclosure and the excite of conceivably revealing a mystery long hidden. After a few hours of cautious uncovering, they revealed parts of objects in part buried profound in the soil, the To begin with disclosure, a cluster of rusted nails, ancient and turned and inserted in the soil, as in spite of the fact that long overlooked to indicate of development wood or maybe remainders of the sheets that once fixed Ruth Carver's cabin. They found another an ancient bolt, intensely rusted, the press eroded, and set, however, unmistakably. Useful in its plan, the keyhole still, unmistakable in spite of the fact that rugged and misshaped, the bunch hypothesized that it might have had a place to a chest or an entryway long since crushed, and the third, revelation shards of glass, little and sporadic, catching the winding down light and flickering with sharp reflections. The parts inserted with soil and ice, recommending they had lain there for decades untouched, since sometime recently the cabin burned, and maybe indeed sometime recently Ruth Carver vanished inside and out. The combination of nails, bolt, and glass filled the bunch with both fervor and unease, as in spite of the fact that they had bumbled upon a layer of her nearness itself, protected in the soil. The talked about among themselves the meaning of these revelations. The nails may be leftovers of the sheets utilized to near off the upstairs room of the cabin, the bolt conceivably from the trunk Ruth carried to the quarry, the shards of glass possibly from a window smashed in the fire, or a thing of her ownership broken and disposed of over time. Each piece telling a part of the story, astound. That might not completely be completed, but advertising tantalizing insights to those willing to see closely the soil around. The fines dull and moist and cold, squeezing against their gloves and hands, the disgust overwhelming with the fragrance of soil and ice and the blackout metallic tang of rust that appeared to hang and whirl around them like a whisper of the pastas. The evening developed darker and the wind cleared through the trees. The gather got to be progressively mindful of the stories encompassing Ruth Carver, the pale lady carrying a light in some of the time, a trunk along the way to the quarry, the vanished men, the bolted room, the showdown on the yard, the vanishing of Ruth herself, and the burned cabin, all of it condensed into an unmistakable weight, squeezing on the location and on their nerves. The shadows appeared to move with a life of their claim, the branches over stirring in designs that imitated development, and the soil appeared heavier, as in spite of the fact that carrying the memory of decades of fear and wonder all around them, the whisper of takes off, and the far-off sound of streaming water, including a soundtrack to the scene that felt both antiquated and prompt. At once asterisk they proceeded to burrow carefully and deliberately, taking photos and notes the artifacts they revealed, washed briefly in the dim light and held up to the gather as they conjectured on beginnings and reason. The rusted nails turned and bowed, telling of development, and wrought the bolt proposing mystery and assurance, the shards of glass reflecting little impressions of their claim on edge faces. The encounter both elating and terrifying. The gather moved as if guided by an undetectable drive along the line where the soil appeared wealthiest with remainders, and each thing revealed appeared to affirm the stories they had examined and listened over the a long time and however advertised. No last answers, as it were, parts that prodded the intellect and the creative ability and reminded them that a few riddles persevere past documentation, past clarification, past the reach of Rizona's. Night fell completely, the disgust developed colder, the wind cutting more honed through coats and scarves, the shadows developing into a near black that appeared to near in around them, the stream reflecting the dim moonlight like a silver lace winding past the rocks. The bunch stuffed their instruments gradually, knowing that the day had yielded no grave, no tombstone, no last resting put for Ruth Carver. However, they carried with them the physical updates of her life and vanishing, the rusted nails, the ancient bolt, the shards of glass, each one a part of history, a token of riddle, a clue, and a whisper of her nearness. And the way back to town appeared longer than it had on the way, in each step squeezing the weight of the soil and the story into their awareness, the memory of what they had revealed taking after them through the haziness and the cold. And so the bunch of beginner students of history cleared out the quarry that night with overwhelming boots and heavier minds. Their scratch pad full of draws and depictions, their photos capturing parts of soil and rust and glass, their recollections. Carrying the sense of wonderment and unease that comes from touching something that has persevered over a century, the wind. Through the trees carrying echoes of ancient stories, the legend of Ruth Carver reinforced and affirmed by their disclosures. The town noiseless in its claim way, the quarry and the soil, presently holding, however, another layer of secret and witness and the rusted nails. The ancient bolt and shards of glass buried profound in the soil, serving as a persevering update that, whereas no gravestone stamped her grave, the follows of her life, her vanishing, and her legend may never be completely deleted from the soil, or the memory of those who looked for Heron over the taking after days the stories of the discoveries. Circulated among townsfolk and individual students of history, carefully whispered, shared, and cautious, tones emphasizing the parts and the soil and the riddle more than the genuine individual and the quarry. Itself remained a put of calm caution, a location of shadow and nearness and memory, and the beginner students of history carried forward their encounters, including, however, another chapter to the long, running story of Ruth Carver and the follows she cleared out behind in rust and glass, and soil to remind all who would tune in and look for that a few riddles persevere past life and non-appearance, and the soil itself can hold on to the memory of those who walk its ways and disappear without follow whether Ruth Carver was a killer, a casualty of mass insanity, or something stranger, totally no one in Elmbrook may ever say with certainty. The stories and whispers had developed and turned over the decades, fueled by fear, by theory, by the unusual and mystifying occasions that had encompassed her life, and vanishing, the burned cabin, the bolted upstairs room, the vanished men, the trunk at the quarry, the pale lady carrying a light and moving noiselessly over the ice-tipped grass, all of it coalesced into a legend that no one might completely unravel from reality. And however, one thing was copiously clear to the individuals of Elmbrook: they needed her gone, they needed her memory eradicated, they needed the boulevards and the areas and the ways to the quarry free from the weight of her nearness and the unease that clung to those who had seen her or listened to stories, or seen the shapes and shadows that appeared continuously to take after her mammoth. Town acted appropriately. The cabin burned the sheets. Nailed over the windows and entryways for a long time, the church records cleansed of her title children, cautioned not to talk of her or she listened them, grown-ups talking as it were in quieted tones when the theme emerged, the town itself moving, in calm acquiescence to a collective crave to expel Ruth Carver from memory and space, as if by constraint of will her presence might be refuted, and however deleting a title does not delete the truth and the soil of the quarry and the ways around. It appeared to keep in mind indeed when the individuals of Elmbrook attempted not to the wind-carried whispers the trees, cast long shadows that bent and moved in ways that felt ponder, and the waterway ran moderate and cold past the put where she had final been seen and where she had carried a trunk into the unknown over. The long-time travelers passing closed the quarry talked of unusual sightings of a pale lady in obsolete clothing carrying a light, some of the time dragging a trunk. Along the solidified or sunlit way, the same figure repeating over decades, her skirts influencing her hair coiled and flawless, her nearness both commanding and spooky, and continuously the address drifting in the minds of those who saw her. Do you? Keep in mind the town still recalls the state rehashing quietly in the head of the eyewitness or delicately carried on the wind. Through the trees, a update that memory cannot be completely eradicated indeed when the living endeavor to expel it. That a few nearness perseveres past the reach of pulverization, past the deletion of records, past the endeavors of individuals to imagine the world has moved on. And the story of Ruth Carver proceeds to reverberate as a constraint that shapes discernment and fear and curiosity. Revelations of beginner students of history in 1998 as it were fortified the secret rusted nails. Parts of sheets, ancient locks, shards of glass buried profound in the soil, closed the quarry unmistakable remainders of her life and vanishing that might not be disregarded or clarified absent the soil itself appeared to hold on to her memory, and the individuals who revealed these artifacts detailed a weight and an unease as if they had touched a layer of history and nearness that stood up to eradication. The quarry remained a location of cautious shirking, the ways congested, the shadows profound, and moving the stories and notices circulating through the town and among travelers, fortifying the idea that Ruth Carver's impact expanded distant past her life, that her non-attendance did not evacuate her from the world that she had cleared out, follows both physical and ghostly, that persevered and requested affirmation indeed in silence, and the townsfolk, caught on this profoundly, they had attempted to bury her nearness, delete her title, conceal her story, and however it continued, carried on wind and stream and shadow, on ice-tipped grass and sunlit rocks. The burned cabin had not been sufficient. The evacuation from records inadequately, the notices to children simply a fractional security against the reality that a few puzzles are persevering, a few habitations stand up to the section of time, and that indeed in overlooking there is memory, and in non-appearance there is control. The arrive recollected her, the discuss recalled her, and a few evenings when the wind blew through the trees closed the quarry, when the moon cast silver light over the ice and the rocks, the blackout sound of a woman's voice might be listened delicately, inquiring address that waited in the intellect of anybody who stopped long sufficient to tune in, inquiring if you keep in mind her, and the state carried a weight outlandish to expel a update. That Ruth Carver had strolled there, and that her story was not one or the other, basic nor gonent, so whether she had been blameworthy of violations or only misconstrued by a frightful town, whether she had been a casualty of mass insanity or something stranger past comprehension, the legend of Ruth Carver persevered and formed the awareness of Elmbrook and Fiery, debris empty alike eras of inhabitants, learning to live with the pressure between reality and story, between non-appearance and nearness, between overlooking and recalling the quarry itself, a central point for memory, a put where shadows turn and whispers travel through the branches and over the stream, and a location where travelers in some cases see the pale figure carrying her, light and trunk along the ways, and the weight of all the decades squeezing down with the certainty of truth that denies to be erasive. Nowadays, the stories circulate, carried from guest to guest, shared in whispers at motels and cafes past, along with a sense of wonder and fear. The cautionary stories caution children and grown-ups alike that a few individuals cannot be completely deleted from the scene of memory, that a few habitations persevere past, passing past, vanishing past human understanding, and the rehashed address in the intellect of anybody who comes close the quarry, do you keep in mind her, proceeds to reverberate delicately, as if the arrive itself talks, as if Ruth Carver herself proceeds to move along the ice-tipped grass and over the rocks, carrying her light, her trunk, her story into the living awareness of those willing to take note and keep in mind, and in this way she remains in earnest, unbound by the a long time, by the burned cabin, by the deleted records, by the hush of those who wished her gonent. So the truth endures discreetly, determinedly, a update that a few histories cannot be revamped, a few recollections cannot be eradicated, a few voices proceed to talk indeed when unheard, and a few questions persevere over eras. The townspeople may have made it clear they needed Ruth Carver gone. They may have endeavored to delete each follow of her from the church records, the boulevards, the children's information, the buildings, and the physical world itself, and however the truth of her story, the weight of her nearness, the waiting secret of her life vanishing, and the shadows she cleared out behind remained inserted in the scene carried on the wind, the stream, the ice-tipped ways, and the moving Shadows, a nearness that holds up discreetly, inquiring those who come close the quarry on a still night to keep in mind. Her to recognize her, to hold her story and intellect. And in this way, Ruth Carver perseveres past eradication, past overlooking, past the section of time.